micro affirmations, the little things that people can do that make a big difference. One thing is just being familiar with some of the terms. So it's not about memorizing all of the terms and definitions, that there's lots of different words that people are using to describe themselves, right? So it's not about being an expert on it. The internet's always a great resource. If someone is using a word to describe themselves or their family that is new for you, it's also okay to ask people in those one-on-one situations, like, thanks for telling me that's a new word for me. What does that mean for you? And how can I support you? That words might mean different things to different people, but we're really talking about a couple of different aspects of someone's identity that we've already kind of addressed so far, right? And hearing Reese's story, someone's assigned sex. So their assignment that's made at or before birth based on their internal and external sex organs, as well as people's hormones and their chromosomes. That is not, that's the one of these continuums that's an assignment, right? We tend to think of that as being male or female, but there are a host of different medical conditions that could result in people falling outside of that binary. So hermaphrodite might be a word people are familiar with, but that actually isn't accurate when we're talking about people. So other species can have two fully formed sets of reproductive sex organs. People can't, right? So people might have intersex conditions that could be visibly apparent when they're born based on their anatomy, or it could be something affecting their hormones or their chromosomes. So people's internal, external sex organs, hormones, chromosomes really isn't anyone's business unless someone chooses to share that information. Especially in schools, we're really not concerned about what's underneath people's clothes. We're more concerned about someone's gender identity, that deeply felt internal sense of who someone is, right? Oftentimes that's established fairly early. For some people, it might be later in life, but when we're talking about young people socially transitioning, like Reese said, around the age of 3 or 4 is when young people typically start to identify more than just being drawn to those gendered things like toys or clothes or colors, but having a deeply felt sense of who they are. So for some folks, they might recognize that at a young age, but not share that until later. For myself, I knew I was trans since I was, 2, 3, 4 years old, but I didn't have the word to describe that experience. And the messages that young people are getting at home, at school, in our culture, in the media, right? If that message is that it's not okay to be who you are, they may also not share that until later in life. And other folks might not recognize that about themselves until they get older, that it might be more of a process. But when we're talking about young people who are transitioning, they tend to be people who have had that insistent, consistent, and persistent sense of their gender identity being different from their assigned sex from a fairly early age. And oftentimes the mental health symptoms, other challenges that folks might be dealing with, anxiety, depression, trouble sleeping, all of these symptoms are tend to be significantly alleviated once that person is able to be their authentic selves. So the question that typically comes up is, what are the differences between folks that are trans, right? Whether they're a transgender man, so someone like myself or Harper, assigned female at birth, identifying as being a boy or a man, or a transgender girl or woman, so someone assigned male at birth, whose gender is being a girl or a woman. That there are people who are also non-binary who don't fit within those labels, right? That boy or girl, man or woman don't fully describe that person's experience. So that can mean a lot of different things. Being non-binary is kind of telling you what someone isn't versus what they are. So when we're talking about supports that non-binary people might need, that might look a little bit different than someone like myself or Harper, going from using a girl's bathroom to a boy's bathroom, she pronouns to he pronouns. For non-binary people, those gendered spaces and practices might not make sense for them. So using pronouns like they and them or other gender neutral pronouns can be new and tricky for people. But the more time you spend doing that, the easier it gets. There were questions in the survey around, if you mess up on someone's name or pronoun. And really the best practice is to just correct yourself and move on, that you don't need to draw more attention to it or even apologize. Just say she, I mean them, right? Just correcting yourself, modeling for people that the more time you spend doing it, the easier that gets. And that it's better to make a mistake and learn from it and model that you're putting in that effort than it is to just avoid that. that most people can tell if someone makes a mistake because they're trying to be hurtful or disrespectful versus if someone makes a mistake because it's new and, they just need to practice, right? So not letting that fear of making a mistake stop folks from having these conversations. And it's also okay to say, like, hey, this is new for me, right? I'm trying my best. That, again, it's really about that intention. A question that typically comes up, especially when we're talking about young people, is, the differences between folks that are trans or non-binary versus people that just step outside of these traditional gender boxes of what it means to be masculine or feminine. So gender expression are all the ways in which people express their gender. So when we're talking about gender expression, this is something that can be really important to people. There oftentimes is consequences when people step outside of these traditional gender boxes of what's considered masculine or feminine. And it's also something that can be culturally determined. So it doesn't mean that that's not real or isn't important, but really based on someone's background, where they're from, their culture, that what makes someone masculine or feminine might look different. So people have different ideas about what is a masculine trait or activity versus feminine, right? And so that might look different across cultures, different time periods. But when we're talking about gender expression, we're talking about the things that are gendered in our culture, whether that be hair length or styles, colors, toys, bathrooms, pronouns, colors, right? All of these things tend to be gendered. And in most cases, especially young people, they might step outside of these traditional gender boxes. So there are girls that maybe have short hair, boys that want to paint their nails or wear dresses. That doesn't necessarily make those people transgender. That those are folks that step outside of those traditional gendered boxes, but still identify with their assigned sex, that there's not the intense level of distress, discomfort, other mental health issues that we typically would see in someone who is transgender before they're able to transition, right? And once they're able to transition, whatever that looks like for them, whether that is a social transition, medical transition, both, right? That those symptoms are significantly alleviated.
Everyone here has spoken about those kinds of key moments and positive experiences that really grounded them and allowed them to build on through their childhood as positive experiences. So Amanda has a lot of research that she is available to share on that particular subject, as well as she's created a toolkit for supporting LGBTQ2A youth through the Center for Child Wellbeing and Trauma, and she has a very firm grasp and research foundation on the national context and kind of a wider scale. So to zoom out and share more about this, Amanda is here to hop on.
No pressure though, right? Like super low bar there. Hi, everybody. So for my day job, I talk about the key types of positive childhood experiences that we know build health and well-being and resilience. And the science behind positive childhood experiences is on the newer side, right? Like ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Show of hands for folks who have heard of ACEs before. Yeah, that's been around since the late 90s, right? There was a study out of Southern California from Kaiser Permanente where they asked adults questions about their demographics and their childhood experiences, and they developed this framework that key types of really horrible things that can happen to you in childhood actually can impact us throughout the lifespan, right? And that was really important research because it developed trauma-informed care kind of as we know it. Fast forward to about 2015, there were folks in Wisconsin, of all places, who were like, so we know ACEs are really important, but are there key types of good things that can happen in childhood to kind of offset some of those bad things? And so they did a study themselves. It was part of their Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey Study, or BRFIS, which, if you know me, you know that BRFIS and muffin are fabulous words in my vocabulary, and I encourage you to use both daily. But the BRFIS study, every state in our country does it. It's a phone screen. They call adults. So there's a sampling bias because you have to have a phone. And they ask you to think back to your childhood. And in the past, they had just asked adults about not so great things that happened in childhood. But in Wisconsin in 2015, they decided to ask about positive experiences that could happen in childhood. hold up, everybody. This is going to be a shock. I actually have a slide here. I'm going to share my screen to make it more visually stimulating so you're not just staring at my face, because there are better things to stare at. So in Wisconsin, they asked those adults these questions. So having them think back to their childhood. How often did they feel like they could talk to their family about their feelings? They felt like their family stood by them during difficult times. They enjoyed participating in community traditions, felt a sense of belonging in high school, felt supported by friends, had at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in them, and felt safe and protected by an adult in their home. And it was scaled, so you could say never, sometimes, almost always, or always. And if you said almost always or always that you could remember these things, you would get 1 point. So there are 7 questions here. You get a total possible score of 7 for your PCE score. And what they found was that the more positive childhood experiences somebody could recall, the better their adult mental health was. So if you could say almost always or always to 6 or 7 of those questions, about 87.4% of folks reported good mental health, compared to those who couldn't really remember any of those positive experiences, or maybe just 1 or 2. A little less than 52% reported good mental health. And the more positive childhood experiences you could recall, the better your adult mental health was. And so this was really interesting to us, right? Because when I'm gonna skip ahead here, so close your eyes if scrolling makes you dizzy. When you looked at that same group in Wisconsin, but only the folks who had experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, 4 or more like deeply traumatic things from childhood, the results held. So even if somebody had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, if they could still recall 6 or 7 positive childhood experiences, only about 21% of them reported depression or poor mental health, compared to those who had 4 or more ACEs and couldn't remember any positive childhood experiences, or maybe only 1 or 2, about 61% of them reported depression or poor mental health. And oftentimes when we see kids, when we see youth, when we see families, the trauma has happened, right? When we're thinking specifically about queer youth, LGBTQ2IA+ youth, that trauma can be ongoing. We know that our LGBTQ2IA+ youth, while incredibly resilient, also on average have higher ACE scores than their cisgender heterosexual peers. But what this research shows us is that even in the context of a whole lot of terrible things happening that nobody should ever have to be resilient towards, if you can wrap that child or that individual in these key types of positive experiences, you can actually change their trajectory into adulthood as far as their health and their well-being is concerned. And so this original study, like I said, happened in Wisconsin in 2015. Since then, a ton of other states have done similar research, and the findings are being replicated, across the country in far more diverse samples than Wisconsin can offer. And we're also seeing that the more positive childhood experiences you have, not just better mental health, but better physical health, lower rates of cardiovascular disease, more likely to be employed full-time, higher household incomes, lower overall rates of substance use across a lifetime, which kind of begs the question of what are the key types of positive childhood experiences we should be supporting kids and youth in accessing, right? So they're not rocket science, turns out. The folks at the HOPE Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences National Resource Center did kind of an extensive review of the field of anybody talking about good things that happen in childhood and long-term health outcomes. And what they found was that those things that seem to have the biggest bang for their buck fall into these 4 buckets, which again, if you have kids or you work with kids, you're probably already doing some of it. It's relationships with caregivers, but also safe adults who care about kids and peers who will listen. It's safe environments to live, learn, and play, where kids have access to their basic needs and where they feel emotionally and physically safe. It's opportunities for engagement, to be a part of something bigger than yourself, to develop that sense of mattering and belonging, and opportunities for emotional growth. And when you think back to the stories that we heard today, those personal stories, in every situation, you can pull out those building blocks, right? You can pull out the people who were there for those kids, the ways that their families made sure their environments were safe, the ways they were able to access that engagement, right, of being part of something bigger than themselves. And so again, when we're thinking about LGBTQ2IA+ youth, there are certain barriers to these building blocks that are unique for our youth in this population. So I had worked with the Center on Child Wellbeing and Trauma to develop a toolkit, and we actually developed 3 different toolkits, one for folks in education, one in healthcare, and one for folks working at community-based organizations. And I had an advisory council of amazing queer youth from across the country. They ranged in age from 12 to 19 and had a whole range of experiences. There were kids who were currently in Texas and growing up in that context. And there were kids in the Bay Area who got, white glove treatment as they transitioned, and kind of best case scenario. And so they really informed the toolkits that are available to the public, and we'll pop the link into the chat. But generally speaking, those toolkits kind of walk you through what it means to promote equitable access to these building blocks for LGBTQ2IA+ youth. Because again, we know if we can wrap these kids in these key types of positive experiences that they might have trouble accessing depending on the school that they're in, we can actually help them make it to adulthood, number one, and be healthier, thriving adults. So I want to be respectful of time. I know that there were a lot of questions that came in, so I might pause here. The toolkits are in the chat. The way it works is there's some videos you can watch, but the fun part, I think, is there's a self-assessment that you can do. And you can do this either as an individual person, just thinking about your own classroom or the space that you have control over, or you can get together with your school, you can get an advisory council of queer youth, and you can do a self-assessment together to get the context for the bigger culture. And then I know the Center for Child Wellbeing and Trauma is offering technical assistance for folks who want to create an action plan and start implementing. I think there are a lot of resources in there to get you started. But I'm gonna cede the floor so that we have time for some Q&A.
Would love to open it up to any questions. Stephen, go ahead.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you very much. That was pretty powerful. And I feel like the research that you showed from Wisconsin is really valid, regardless about what I'm about to say, but I'm just looking for some information. So it appears that the data that was collected for the positive childhood experiences is more subjective than the data that you would collect from the ACEs. And I'm just wondering if anyone has done any work on trying to operationalize those terms so that we could then take that data and maybe create more sustainable change for students or for children?
Great question. I have feelings about those 7 questions. I have feelings about giving anybody a score, whether it's a positive childhood experience score or an ACE score, because I feel like it doesn't actually tell the story. those 7 questions were pulled from a larger survey on adolescent health that was being conducted by the World Health Organization. And so I believe there is a far more rigorous set of questions that folks can use. But again, remember, those questions are intended for adults to think back to their childhood. And so by nature, they're going to be subjective. We have some resources at Hope that are more about opening the door to understanding how youth currently access the building blocks, right? Those positive childhood experiences and where the barriers are, that I feel is much more actionable than providing individual scores. And so I think those resources are in the toolkit, and you can find those there. But the thing about the building blocks is they're big buckets, and the child or the youth in front of you gets to decide what goes into each bucket, right? So we have said engagement is critically important, but for Harper, that might be ice hockey. For somebody else, that might be dance, and making sure that you understand what specifically goes into each bucket is the key to actually unlocking the positive experience. So I know a lot of, you talk to organizations and they're like, oh, well, we have all these amazing resources for youth engagement, but they haven't actually talked to the youth to see what they want. And then nobody shows up at these resources and they're like, well, we're trying, we don't know what happened. So we encourage schools, community-based nonprofits to ask the youth, how are they defining these building blocks? How are they accessing these building blocks? And what is preventing them from accessing it? What are the barriers that you can help remove? I kind of talked about it, Stephen, but does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
The only thing I would add to that is we have our state youth risk behavior survey that for decades we've collected data on at least same-sex sexual experiences and sexual orientation. And in the last decade, also around gender identity. And then we're able to disaggregate the data. There are some very concrete questions that get right to Amanda's boxes there that are in the YRBS around participation in extracurricular activities, adults you could speak to, a caring adult, exercise, nutrition, some concrete questions, sexual experiences that you could advocate at the local level what data you collect. And that's a wonderful question to ask. Like, do we do our own version of the youth risk behavior survey? What questions do we ask? What questions do we ask about identity and sexual orientation that we could actually disaggregate the data and look at our local data around? So I know, Stephen, in Lexington, you're doing that already, and there are people disaggregating the data in Lexington. I think that's where you are, right? And I know that you've been one of the leaders to look at disaggregating the data around that. So feel free to talk to us and resources they have at the department regarding guidance and doing that as well as the school climate survey, which we have the state data on that has incredible, powerful data on non-binary students and the disproportionate negative outcomes that we're seeing there. So great question.
I think we should have time for about 1 or 2 more questions from anyone in the audience for anyone who spoke today. It looks like Haley has one in the chat. Can you share some general advice for how we can support trans and non-binary youth who are not out at home / supported by their families?
Yeah, so I think that's probably, excuse me, the number one question that we get, especially when a student is saying, I want to use this name at school and this name at home. And I think the best advice is to really not get polarized around like, what's our policy? Do we support the student or do we support the family? That, you always want to help develop a plan to engage families, and really depending on the age of the student and what they're asking for, right? So if a student is using a name with just their counselor, right, that plan to how to involve families is going to probably look different than if a student is using their name with every single person and student in your school and then say, I don't want my family to find out, right? That, we want to have a plan that if this, comes back to your family, that we're not creating a crisis here. So a gender support plan is a good resource for folks who are working one-on-one with students to just get a sense of who else is using this name. And, if this comes up with your parents, how should we approach this, right? And sometimes it's communicating with families that you'll use the name and pronouns that the family wants to use when talking to the family. And when you're talking to the student, that you use the name and pronouns that students want you to use, right? That's one way to kind of lower the temperature a little bit. And that our program can also help provide the more one-on-one technical assistance questions. But I think developing a plan with the student that, at some point families are involved in these conversations, and being one person at school and one person at home isn't the best long-term solution. So how can we support you in the moment? And let's be proactive so that, we're not creating a crisis, right? We've had students say, I want to change my name in the school system. My family can't find out, right? And coming out to your parents by the report card coming home and them opening it is probably not going to create a great situation, right? So I think it really depends on the student and their age, but using the name and pronouns students want to use, and then having a plan around how can we involve your family. And we also talk a lot about the continuum of acceptance, that when students say my family isn't supportive, to really understand what that means, because it could mean anything from, this is a safety concern, the student's going to be homeless, or, the family actually is very supportive and they have some questions, or they're struggling to correct themselves, right? So the Family Acceptance Project is a great resource that's available online for free in multiple different languages that identifies this continuum from rejecting to celebratory. And the goal really isn't to move families from saying, I don't like it, I don't support it, you're kicked out of the house, to marching in a pride parade, but to move them from, I don't like it, I don't support it, you're kicked out, to I don't like it, I don't support it, but you're my kid and I love you and you can live here, right? That little bit of support can make an enormous difference on that young person's mental health. So moving families along a little bit can really impact that student more than just trying to get a family to go from one end of an extreme, right? So the Family Acceptance Project also has like key things that hurt and key things that help, because saying love and support your child is great, but what does that actually look like, right? Like when Elijah spoke about his mom and some of the things that, she believed was in his best interest that actually were hurting him, right? That most families do want to love and support their children and just need some of the kind of concrete ways to be able to do that. So Jeff, I don't know if there's other resources that you wanted to chime in with around the family support piece.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in. That would be great. And we will be sending out resources afterwards. We're resources and some of these links that have been referred to, but the Family Acceptance Project is an excellent one. And just like Reese shared, that introducing Harper to older transgender young people and adults through playing hockey, CJ and Luke and others, one of the things that Caitlin Ryan found from San Francisco State in the Family Acceptance Project, that introducing your child to an older LGBTQ person was one of the things that made a difference, as well as inviting their friends over. So we talked a lot about social support here, that friends, relationships matter. Sometimes, as Landon said, the single biggest thing you can do to support a student or a parent is introduce them to another student or parent, or help to strengthen their support network, support or strengthen it. Parents have a remarkable capacity to love and support their child. We have a lot more in common than indifference. And I think that really trusting that parents, that when power comes in the door, love goes out the window. So this is not about student or parent rights. And I really encourage you to read the legal decision. Ludlow, we have several people from Western Mass. Ludlow Public Schools was sued a couple years ago. Counselors, psychologists, principals. There were 10 people named in the lawsuit because they had a policy that left parents out, it was middle school that was being sued because they had a policy that they called students by the name and pronouns that they wanted and left the parents out. And the lawsuit was claiming that parents' civil rights were violated. Well, it's a beautifully written law decision, 21 pages. It's accessible if you just want to read page 16 of it, and we can send you the link to that, or you can get it online. It's a beautiful part of the decision where it's basically common sense. What the judge rules is that the school did not violate parents' civil rights by not informing them, and they overreached by interpreting DESE's guidance as saying that parents shouldn't be involved at all. That basically, of course, you want to support the student, and you should always have a plan about how you're going to engage and involve the parents. Not that you're going to violate the student's confidentiality, but you're not going to just like call a student by the name and pronouns that they want and cross your fingers and hold your breath that everything works out. That you're going to approach rather than avoid. You're always going to say, so that if a teacher comes to you and says, I'm not going to call a student by this name with the parents not knowing, I wouldn't want that to happen to my child. You want to be able to say, of course, we are not leaving. That is all part of our plan. That's the best practice. And it's a sensitive situation, so we want to make sure we're doing it in a thoughtful manner. Anything you can do, as Landon said, to lower the temperature, to recognize we have a lot more in common with each other than indifference, and helping to find what those areas of commonality are. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a student is to develop a relationship with their parent or guardian. And that might mean in an IEP meeting, calling them by their birth name and pronouns, and as a way of connecting with the family members, to be like, so that they're relaxing and recognize that you understand and are listening to them, and that the student understands that this is all a way to get people to love and celebrate them for who they are.
And I would also just remind folks too, I think sometimes there's cultural or religious or language barriers that, there are people from every background, every religion, every culture, every country, right, that are unsupportive. And there's also people of every background, religion, culture, ethnicity, country, right, that are supportive. And I think sometimes connecting folks to people of a similar background, right, connecting people to folks that might not be on the celebratory end, but people who are a little bit farther along, can help to be that resource that, there are additional challenges with some of these things. And so connecting families, when we talk about social support, it's sometimes the families that actually need more support than the students do. And so connecting them to other parents, other families. I know Greater Boston PFLAG has a peer-to-peer support network. So, they can connect a family of a transgender girl, or a family who speaks Spanish, or a family who's Muslim, with another family of a similar background, to help create that community and figure out where they can get some of that support. So I just want to add that as a resource, because I think those barriers come up a lot when schools aren't necessarily sure how to respond to parents' questions or concerns.
So fear may be the way the day begins. It's not the way the day ends. And sometimes the best thing you could do is really connect with the parent and or guardian and say, your child has not let fear come in the way of being their authentic self. You should be so proud that you've raised the child to be so courageous. The other thing that is so important, we talk about scanning for safety, that anytime your identity is steeped in secrecy or silence, people are looking for any clue that you're a safe, supportive, or approachable person. So visibility matters. Visibility matters. How many of you, just raise your hand if you have anything in your office or classroom that visibly shows support for LGBTQ students or families? So I don't know what you might have. I usually have a rainbow flag or a trans flag. Here's my sticker on my backpack here. There was one mom of a trans child who went to a school committee meeting and said she saw a sticker, a Safe Zone sticker on the computer of the principal. And she said, at that moment, I knew my child was going to be safe and supportive in this school. So never underestimate the importance of visibility, of having books, stickers, flags, pronouns, things that signal that you are a safe, supportive, approachable person. Visibility matters. So thanks so much for being here. And Amanda,